Welcome. My name is Olivier Commando with Foreign Policy Digest. Today we're joined by Anne-Marie Slaughter, who is Dean of the Woodrow Wilson School of International Affairs at Princeton University. She is also a former lawyer or former professor at Harvard Law School, a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and author of a new book, The Idea That Is America. So, welcome.
Great. Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Well, I wanted to start off with something that's timely. Obviously, this past weekend we had the invasion of Georgia, or South Ossetia, by the Russians. And given the fact that you've written a lot about international law and the international framework, how does the international community, whether that be the UN or whatever series of multinational organizations, respond to Russia when there's this threat of, or actually they've actually already invaded South Ossetia and sort of violated their territorial integrity?
So there are two ways to look at this, and one is, well, this just shows how weak international institutions are. There's a charter that Russia signed, and all nations have signed, that says they won't use force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any nation. And Russia signed that, but Russia just went in and certainly has violated the territorial integrity of Georgia. Now, Russia will say in its own defense, now hang on, Georgia provoked this. Georgia sent troops to South Ossetia. Georgia says, well, that's part of us. We can do that. But Russia says, no. Many of the people, most of the people in South Ossetia don't want to be part of Georgia, and they have Russian passports. So Russia says, we're protecting our own people. Georgia says, you're in our territory. The world now says, when their tanks getting closer to the Georgian capital, this is not okay. So the first thing to look at is to say, well, this just shows that international institutions are toothless, and what you need are great powers that can stop other great powers. But the story is a little more complicated than that, because there are two things to know. One is, when the United Nations was set up, President Roosevelt understood that an international organization would not work if you didn't pay attention to who had the power. You couldn't just say, oh, we're going to be a world of love and harmony and law, and you sign a piece of paper and you say you won't do things and you won't do them. So he set it up so that the great powers of 1945, which were Britain and France and the United States and China and Russia, all have a veto on the Security Council. So if the UN condemns Russia, the UN Security Council, Russia will veto that. Right. Now you say, well, that's crazy, but when the UN Security Council condemns Israel, we veto it. And occasionally when we've wanted to do things, the UN Security Council can't move, because the whole point is the great powers have to agree. Right. So one way to understand this is, look, the international institutions understand power dynamics, and you can't expect them to work independently of who's got the power. But the happier side of the story is that, at least as of today, Russia has not invaded the Georgian capital. Russia has agreed to a ceasefire. It violated the ceasefire, but basically there's a lot of diplomatic pressure being put on Russia right now, and Russia knows that if it goes any farther, it could get kicked out of the World Trade Organization, or suspended from the G8 of the top industrialized countries, that lots of other countries could pull back in diplomacy. So the UN actually gives us a way of putting a lot of pressure. You can't stop the invasion, and Russia has definitely made its point to Georgia, I'm a big country, you're a little country, you better not go join NATO. Right. But there is a way of pushing back. So
it sounds like there is sort of a lot of cards still to play with regards to within the UN or international legal framework. But at what point does it take too long to sort of stop the bull in its tracks, and at what point do you start to investigate other options, whether that be military force or?
Well, so here's the basic fact of this situation, which is absolutely critical for anybody thinking about international relations. You have to put it in the American context. Let's imagine that Russia is supporting Cuba against us, as Russia has done for many, many years. But Russia actually has its own alliance, and it's sort of spreading its power forward, and it bumps up against the United States, countries on our border, and says, we're supporting you, we want you to essentially be against the United States. We, at that point, say, whoa, this is our neighborhood, and you don't mess in our neighborhood. And what Russia is saying is, hold on, Georgia is not on your border, it's on our border. It is our area of interest, and you can expand NATO, our alliance, all the way to that border. And that's a basic fact of international relations. You've got your neighborhood, and the United States, as much as we support the Georgians and the democracy in Georgia, and we truly do, we are not going to send troops into Georgia to fight Russia, which is right there,
right,
even if we didn't have troops tied down in Iraq and Afghanistan. So in this instance, diplomacy may be long and slow, but I don't think there's any chance that the United States or NATO are going to send troops in. Humanitarian relief, yes, but send in troops to fight Georgia. I mean, just to give you another, it doesn't always play out that way, because when Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1991, that was a situation where the whole world said, you just can't do this.
Right.
There was no provocation, you can't do this. So sometimes the world will join together, but in this case, if you went against Russia, you could find yourself in nuclear war.
So we've sort of got two dynamics. There's the harsh reality that we're not going to send troops in because of all these other political consequences.
Right.
But we also have the situation where when the U.S. is working in concert with other countries, there is sort of this international support.
Yes.
But where does the NATO's bombing of Kosovo fit in? Where that was sort of outside the legal framework, but we went ahead and did it.
Right.
And
right.
It's not really brought up. It's not really. It doesn't really fall in either one of those categories. How do we deal with that?
So that's a great question, and Kosovo illustrates the two big forces in international relations. So I just gave the sort of realist view. Power matters, and if you're a big country with small countries around you, you have more to say in terms of what happens in that area than another big country somewhere else. That's the realist view. At the same time, we do have these international institutions, and it is what Russia is doing right now is illegal and illegitimate, and it will pay a cost. It will pay a diplomatic cost, and longer term, it could pay an economic cost as various investors decide we don't really want to be investing in a country that's acting that aggressively. So it will pay a cost, and that's the force of values or law or what we call liberal internationalism. Kosovo is a situation in which the world saw something that was immoral and illegal. I mean, the Serbs were essentially moving in for ethnic cleansing in Kosovo, and we'd seen them do this in Bosnia and Croatia. So it was very clear that if you didn't stop Milosevic, you were going to see yet another country in chaos, or a province, and a tremendous humanitarian disaster. So that's one where, if you'd gone to the UN Security Council, Russia would have vetoed,
right,
just like here.
Right.
But it was very close to Europe. It was in Europe's backyard, and NATO is a European and American alliance, so NATO was in a position to act, even though it didn't go through the Security Council. It did essentially follow the values of the United Nations, in the sense that you shouldn't allow a country to ethnically cleanse another country.
Right.
The complication is Russia was not happy about that, and Russia has regarded Kosovo becoming independent as something it didn't want to have happen, and something it's very nervous about. So Georgia, you see these two forces sort of pushing. There's the force that says, wait a minute, you have to do what's right. And then there's the force that says, but our international institutions also recognize power.
Right. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be back with Dean Slaughter, who is Dean of the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton University.